Welcome to this tutorial. Um, in this tutorial we're going to see how to model a tobacco paper that they used in the 17th century, so to store the tobacco and transport it in their pocket. It was a very common thing to do and everybody almost had it with them. So when going out to the pub, smoking a pipe was very common, like you see on these paintings. Almost everybody had it, enjoying the smoke. The tobacco is a pretty rough tobacco, so it's not like you can find it today, very fine and light. So it were big pieces. Now we have to select the best image to start modeling from. I think I will take this one, so I'll put this on my left screen so that I can always see my original reference model. So let's start. First we're going to put the units on metric so that we see our meters. We start with a plane, then we scale it down to more or less already the correct dimensions. Then we go into edit mode and start adding some edges, subdividing, and start cutting the creases. So think a little bit about your reference image, how the creases are going, on which sides. It can be a little bit randomized, it doesn't need to be exactly the same, because later on you will anyway adjust it such a way that it will be correct. You cannot have it from the beginning exactly correct. So just dividing a bit, cutting, but still more or less in horizontal lines. It's not such an easy object actually. I mean, on the first it looks easy, but yeah, once you start working on it, you will see that it is some work to make this. So I'm putting the global shape lines first, so in a straight line, and then later on we will fold the rest. I need to add another edge there to have some more structure. Part of the paper is laying on a table, so it should be flat, that it can support itself. Always start with a very simple shape and then slowly add more edges depending on the curves you want to create, the creases that they are in the paper. So now I'm making like the first crease on the left side of the object. Try to make this as clean as possible. So avoid triangles, because you know later on we will add the subdivision modifier to add more polygons. When you have triangles, it creates not so beautiful results. So you can have here and there a triangle, but try to avoid it. So it's just a matter of translating part by part in the correct way. So here there's some bending to the right, and we do first the right side, the complete right side, and then we will change also the left side. It goes a bit down in the middle. So now we're going to use the proportional editing brush to bend it more easily without having to manually select all the vertices or edges. You can create very fast bendings with this system. And so whatever is in the circle, it will deform a percentage of what you've selected. The bigger the circle, the more vertices will go with it. So yeah, it's just a matter of getting the right shape, looking a lot at your reference model. It's a lot of manual work. You need to also think in this case the paper on both sides it's the same thickness. So if you think about it, it's actually a rectangle, a plane that has been folded. So try to think that if you would make it flat again, that it still has more or less the rectangular shape. So one side should not be very long compared to the other side because it has everywhere the same width. I think now already the basic shape is pretty comparable to our reference model. Let's add just another edge in the center so that we can still add some more detail because it's not so flat in the middle. Like I said, think about the center that it should still be flat because it's laying, we're modeling it like it's laying on a table or something. So let's just actually model a table so that we can have visual information if we are through the table or not. I'm just going to move the ends a bit away from the table, and now we're already going to save our Blender file for now. So this is like the first stage. I'll just add some more final adjustments. Like you see, it's always good to just look around in any angle that you can see, because in one angle like this viewpoint it can be good, but then when you rotate it you see it's not good. So try to always look at different angles when you're modeling. So we're almost there. Sometimes the most simple objects can actually be the most complex to model. Okay, we're going to smooth it to see what the result is. That's already not too bad. Let's add a subsurface modifier to subdivide the polygons and see what the result is to make the high polygon version. I'm just going to adjust here and there some vertices. Well, that's already not too bad. I prefer in these tutorials to show you almost everything, because if I skip things, it gives a bit of a wrong image of how we really start from scratch to finish. But we are almost there. I'm just adding some more creases. So like you know in the previous tutorial, the closer you put edges, the sharper your mesh will be, your interpolation. So maybe just the curve on the right. If we're going to make that a bit wider open to the right, then I think that's the last thing I will adjust. And then we can continue with the UV mapping and later on the texturing. So just a bit bigger. Yeah, I think this is it. So now we're going to add a surface division modifier. That's some more polygons. That looks fine. Just check the wireframe. Okay, so we're going to apply the scale first, because you know if you UV map and the scale is not correct, it will have wrong dimensions. and you will have stretching problems. So let's UV unwrap this. Just rotate this to center a bit, and minimize stretch modifier so that it tries to optimize the stretching. Mostly doesn't do that much, but in some cases it's a bit better. So the shape when you unfold this model is rectangular, so we should also try to make it in our UV edit window more rectangular. Now it's too much curved, and then later on when you want to brush a texture you also have to curve it, so that's not very ideal. So try to make it as original to your object as possible. So this is already better. Just try to make it even a bit more rectangular with a proportional editing circle. Okay, I think this is fine. So we have of course a square now as a texture, but our object is rectangular. So we should actually also make a rectangular texture instead of a square one. So let's not do this yet, but let's first create a new texture of 1024 by 512, so 2 by 1 proportion. That's also allowed if you use it in games later on or any other platform. You should always try to keep it a power of 2, your texture resolution. So now that we created 2 by 1 texture size, let's try to fit this a bit more. Try to use as much as possible the space so that nothing gets lost. Now we export our UV layout so that we can brush on it in Photoshop, for example. So create a folder textures. Let's save this UV. Uh, 1024 by 512 resolution is enough. We don't need more. It's a small object. You're not going to watch it from 1 centimeter close by, so that's enough. So let's open Photoshop and import this UV texture. Okay, so this is our UV layout. So we can start looking for a texture. Let's go to CG Textures, which is now textures.com. And try to look for something which is white but also has a little bit of dirt. So for me, my favorite section of this categories of textures is a plaster. In plaster you can really do almost any texture you want. You always need to think when you want to make a texture, you can always combine multiple textures, so you will not always find immediately the texture which will be the final color of your model, but always think like you can add as many layers as you want. So let's copy to our location to download the texture, and let's just duplicate this layer to our OpenUV image here. Let's just, because the image is a bit bigger, let's just crop this correctly. Okay. So now this is this. Let's see what this looks like on our model already. So let's just save this as a JPEG in our texture folder. Call it diffuse or something like that. Something clear. And let's save this out. Now let's create a new material in the texture slot of our material. Let's open the texture that we just saved, the underscore diffuse. Okay, let's go into texture mode. We don't see anything because it's not linked in our UV window. Now it is, so this is how it looks. It is, yeah, not so bad, but not really convincing. When you enable GL, SL, what you just saw in the shading, then also the material shininess is shown in the viewport. So it's not bad, but it's not finished, this texture, so you have to do some more adjustment. So the solidify modifier, it gives a thickness to the model. It's of course, a paper is a very, very thin model, but if you don't give it a thickness, and that's something which I didn't do in the beginning and I should have done, is before we UV map it or just after, give it a thickness and then separate the inner side from this model to the outer side, so that we can both give them a different texture, because you know the inner side is more dirty because tobacco is laying in it than the outer side, so they should be both on our UV map. So let's first see the problem here with the polygons, because it creates some weird dark squares. I think it's something to do just with the viewport, that I don't think it's something in the model, so we will fix this later on. So now that we gave it a thickness, let's just first UV map this part again. So let's just select one complete edge, mark seam it, and then we can UV map that completely, but only the outer side. The inner side we already did. So if you just select the side of the outside and you click, or the inside, and you click Ctrl L, you actually select the whole part which is separated from that edge, from that seam that you just made. So that way you can easily select the outer side and the inner side. I'm just going to still create a seam from that edges so that it can nicely spread or open the UV. Let's just do some minimized stretching, and now actually this is what I should have done in the beginning, is give it a thickness and then separate the inner side from the outer side and give it both a different color but in one texture. So it should actually be a square texture instead of 2:1 dimension. I'm just checking here if the right on the bottom is the same as the right on the top. So from the inner and the outer side, they're correctly aligned. Okay. So now I'm going to change the texture to a square. In Photoshop, you can just do that with the image size or canvas size. So now for this UV layout, we can ignore that because we have a new UV made. So let's add again the layer, and first here let's export our new UV. If you change it to a new texture, it will stretch it out because our dimensions was 2:1, and then when you change it to a square it will be squeezed. So scale it again correctly. So sometimes these things happen when you're modeling, and yeah, you don't always see from the beginning how you would take care of it until you come to a problem of, yeah, the inner side texture is the same as the outer side, and that's not really realistic. So let's update our layer of the UV or re-import, and now redo what we've just done. Is add our downloaded texture, duplicate it, that at least we fill now already with a gray color, and later on we can add, we can brush more details, dirt, etc. So let's just name it accordingly and create an empty folder in diffuse so that everything is clean in Photoshop also. Because if you have 1,000 layers just below each other, you have within 1 week no idea anymore what you did. So try to always keep it clean. I'm just brushing a bit away via a mask what I don't want. The mask is very good because you never delete your original texture. You always just use a black and white mask to paint away what you need. Later on you can always rebrush it back, so that's a good thing in Photoshop. So let's save this again. For also the PSD, the original PhD here in Photoshop, that we can always return to that. Let's update it, and now this is the result. You don't see a lot of difference because anyway we just duplicated the texture in Photoshop, so for the moment they shared more or less the same colors. So let's just check the reference images again, paintings, to see how dirty is the paper now actually. Actually not too bad. The inner side is not that different from the outer side, but still it's better to do it immediately properly. Now first what we will do is model the tobacco itself inside the paper. We cannot just brush that with the texture and Photoshop on this paper because it will not have any dimension, any shadow. So it's really a consistent amount of tobacco which is in the paper, so it's better to just make a model out of that. How we do that is I can just start from this model, so I just select the polygons which I will need to start. Once I'm happy with that, I just duplicate them and then separate them with P. You can separate that selection. So we're going to use that as a starting point for modeling our tobacco, which is laying in this paper. The fact that we duplicated that object, it still shares the same material, so we just duplicate that material and also remove this one because later on for the tobacco we'll use another texture. Still in the GLSL viewport you see the problem of some of the polygons, not in multi-texture. So let's just continue in this way. So later on we're going to create a texture for this part, but now let's continue modeling first, adding some more edges, some information, giving it some height in the middle, but leaving it flat on the side so that it's still touching the paper on the edges. That's why I duplicated parts of the mesh so that it already has the correct height. Because otherwise you, if you start from a box, you had to still drag down the vertices until it touches the paper, so it's better to just start from the paper model itself. So now just give it some kind of thickness. Make sure nothing of the inner polygons are through the paper. Just a matter of dragging them up until you're happy with the shape. This is just a bit of a logical thinking, I guess, how to model this. Once you've seen some of the reference images, the amount of tobacco, yeah, just a matter of thinking how it would lay in that paper realistically. Like here, that polygon was too high, just remove that. And once we're happy with this model, we're going to UV map it and give it also a texture, and then we also continue finishing the texture of the paper. It's a bit through the paper on the bottom. Okay, that's fixed. Just merge some vertices to one point. Remove an edge to have it still a quad. Give it a smoothness, and now we're going to add a new texture, but that's for later. And just save it again, the Blender file, to a new file. Always incremental save so that you can return back if necessary. So let's scale this up to fit the dimensions of the UVB map. Because this is a rectangular shape, probably we can use the 2:1 dimension. So let's probably 512 pixels is enough for width. So 512 by 256 pixels is good for this. So you see when you rescale, it scales the UVs back, so you need to scale it in the height by 2 again to make it the correct proportions. So let's export this UV. Okay, and now in Photoshop we can look for a tobacco texture. There's no tobacco, so let's just look in Google. Sometimes you cannot always find the texture you want on a website, so you can just look in Google, maybe you can find anything there. Sometimes the texture can look good, but it would be nice if it's square or rectangular, that you have enough information on the texture to fill your whole model. So let's save this and load this up. Duplicate this layer to the Photoshop, make a diffuse folder and drop it in there. And just rescale a bit. Maybe this could be a bit too big. Let's see what this will give us as a result. So we just save this as a JPEG. Let's always do like kind of diffuse underscore normal to keep consistency. So we load this in, and then it doesn't look that great. There's some stretching, you see, so let's try to use minimize stretching. Still there's more stretching, so I'll try to fix this. So you can always of course manually change it, but you see that these 2 points in the model are belonging together, so also in the UV map they should be together, so we can just merge them here. So now that's already better. Of course now it's just shiny, so we also need to create a bump map to create some structure. Make this black and white, because yeah, bump map is only black and white. Let's save this separate as a bump map and load this in. Okay, disable color, enable normal, and just fill in a value which is good in this case. Still very glossy. Tobacco is not so glossy, so change the hardness and change the specularity color a little bit to a little bit more orange color. So that's already better. Well, we see it now from very close, but normally this will not be used to see so close. So let's also save this as a PSD file so that we always have our original files available. So now let's continue editing the paper, which was not finished. So we just duplicate this for our bump material. I change the color information, remove the color information. I also save as overwrite actually our this is the bump map, so don't overwrite, just resave. And then load in the bump map that we just made. Disable color, enable normal map value. So it's just a very low value because anyway it's a paper, it's not something extremely rough. A little bit less glossy. Okay, maybe a bit wider. Let's try to reduce the noise on our bump texture. It's a bit too much for just a paper. So what we can try is, for example, at curves, you can very fast adjust the global look of your texture. So let's see if we can make it a little bit less noisy, for example like this. So when it's in more even gray, it's less bump. Let's just resave this and see what the result is. Reload. Maybe let's first rename our textures accordingly. Okay, it seems like the black spots needs to be removed instead, because this doesn't feel like it's realistic. So let's just undo what we did, create a new layer, empty layer and a mask. Now first on the layer we're going to fill with an even gray color, like the color you see globally on the image, on the texture. Let's just pick that, fill that in. So now the layer is just gray, and the mask, which is black and white, the white is where it passes through the color of the layer. We're going to use the selection of the black dots, but the problem is we now selected the gray layer and he cannot find the black dots because it's not, the black dots are on these layers. So we select both of these layers or one of them, and now we're going to color range and pick the black. And now he found it, and what we do now from our selection, we are going to fill this in white because that's where it needs to pass through the gray. And what we have now, when we deselect, you see now where it was black, now it passes through that gray color on our layer. See? So in that way we more or less removed the black dots, and it will be less noisy. Clicking on your mask, you activate the selection again, and let's expand first the selection a bit by 1 pixel. And then fill that in with white, so that's a little bit wider. So that's a little bit bigger. And now maybe we can blur our mask a little bit so that it's not too hard, because now you still have bumpiness. Let's just blur it a little bit, such a way that it blends enough with the environment pixels. So this is fine. Let's just save this, override this on our texture, the bump, and see what result this gives. So you saw already now the bumpiness is much less than before. So let's just reduce that to 0.1. Okay, so now what we can also add to the paper texture, apart from adding some darkness, is some tobacco, some scattered tobacco, because now the contrast between the tobacco mesh and the paper is so high it's not realistic. So let's go back to our texture, enable the diffuse, and here we're going to first change the transparency a bit, that we see our UV layout. We're going to copy from our original tobacco texture. We're going to duplicate this to our texture of our paper, because anyway we already made this texture, so we can just reuse it, duplicate it to the paper. Now it's here, the folder is just duplicated. So now we can just position this correctly, but this is very low resolution because remember we downscaled it to 512, the texture itself. So let's just get the original that we downloaded from the internet, because that was much higher. So luckily we saved still these original ones, and now we can duplicate this one to the Photoshop file of the paper, and voila, we have a higher resolution. So let's import this into the diffuse and drag this one away. Don't need that anymore. So now it's just a matter of positioning this correctly, and then using a mask to brush where we want it exactly to be. So let's rescale this first. It's on the upper part of the mesh, so that's the inner side. I'm not going to brush any tobacco on the outside. Let's for a second disable our other textures. And now the difficult thing is, we see here the UV layout. We need to know where the tobacco mesh ends on the texture so that we know where to brush. So let's first already add a mask and then choose the correct size of brush. And let's just invert this so that you don't see anything, and then we brush white to make it visible. It's better than do it the opposite way. So let's just see something is not working. I am on my mask. My transparency is not 100% of my diffuse folder, so everything in the diffuse folder also has 70%. So I change that to 100, and now we can brush 100%. What was also not good was it was on a gray color. So if you brush gray, yeah, it's only 50% of the texture. So you need to make sure you brush with white. Okay, now it becomes visible. So I think now you understand what I was, what my idea was. So it's just a matter of finding a good brush which works for you. Of course, now we don't see any visual feedback of what we've done. So I will just continue a little bit, save this, and then see what the result is. So just enable the textures and resave this. Okay, let's reload this. Okay, so now you see it's a little bit of a mess. Somehow I need to think of a method so that I can brush and know where I'm brushing, because now it's a little bit difficult, just guessing. So what we can do is actually look at the wireframe so that we can compare to the UV seams. So let's try that. Let's enable here the wireframe, and now we can compare with our UV layout. So let's just change the UV here, and now we can compare it, and we can see, okay, on this side of the edge we know it stops. So I just positioned it a bit better. Change transparency, that we can see the UV layout behind it, and now more or less we can compare. And now we just remove a bit, so change the color to black. Yeah? We're filling in with black to hide, and continue brushing away a bit. So now I know where I am brushing on my mesh. Over to the right, a lot needs to be removed because the tobacco mesh itself ends already much further to the left. Also in this kind of folding part, there cannot be any tobacco. We save this, reload this into Blender, and that looks already much better, but still it's not perfect. So let's see what else we can do about it. Okay, let's go back to Photoshop and add some more contrasts. And also not so happy on the sides. It's too blurry, the opacity is not 100% there, and then it makes it look a little bit fake, so I'm going with a 100% transparency brush. Let's see now what this is. Looks better, and just some finalizing. Resave this, and I think this is fine for now. Just remove the wireframe, and the combination is okay. But we need some bump mapping, because now it's still not in a bump mapping, it's only in the color. And tobacco has density, so it's a shape. So now just duplicate the tobacco layer from the diffuse and drag it into the bump map. You know, a bump map for the white comes out and the black is deeper. So the fact that the tobacco is laying on top of the paper should be darker and the tobacco should look wider so that it comes out. So let's create another hue adjustment or saturation layer to remove the color. That's done. And now we should make the tobacco layer itself more bright to make it come out of the paper. So let's create another level layer. Now you'll see if I change, everything will change, and we don't want that. We only want to change the tobacco layer. That means the layer just beneath this layer. So let's create a clipping mask. And what it does is it only points at the immediate layer below it. Now if we change it, it still doesn't work because you need to put it just above the layer that you want to change, so the tobacco layer. So let's create a clipping layer from that, and now this will only work on the tobacco layer, you see. So we have to make that more bright and still try to get more contrast, so it's a little bit of trying out, but something like that will be okay without losing too much information. We don't want to make this too bright, otherwise you lose all the grayness and then you lose information. So let's make the layer behind it also darker, so the paper texture. So create another levels layer and just apply that on the sheet of paper, because remember this is just a bump. It's only what sticks out and what not. So let's see what this gives us. Save the PSD and also save it to the bump. Now see what the result is. Refresh the bump. Okay, and now you see it comes much more out, and now you have more of a feeling that it's laying on top of the paper. So it's always a matter of finding a good balance between the bump map and the diffuse color. Now we name them properly, all the separate objects in our scene, because later on we will also make a low poly model and bake normals, so it's better to do it now than afterwards. Let's duplicate this now. First we're going to continue on the high poly model, so we'll add a subdivision surface. Actually what we've made just is a low poly version, and now we can make the high poly because it's we modeled it at a very low poly way, so that's an advantage. So let's see, I think 2 subdivisions looks better than 3. So let's stick with 2 for the high poly model. Okay. For one of the 2 models, so the high or the low, you can remove the bump map, because as long as one of the 2 have them, it will add it to its normal map. So in this case we remove the material of the high res and we keep the bump map on the low res of our texture that we made. Of course the normal map will also add the geometry. So let's create a new texture for the normal map. 1024 by 1024 is fine. Let's just select for the geometry. So here we will load in our normal map later on when it's baked, like we call it. So I already made here my normal map. So let's just activate it in the UV slot. You know, when you bake it, you first need to select the high poly, then the low poly model, and then you can bake it. So like in the previous tutorial, I think this doesn't matter because we anyway created the texture of 1024. Activate normals here, and now we can bake it. Like you see, there's no result here because we forgot to activate selected to active. You need to do that to be able to bake from your selection. Voila, so now it baked our normals. You see there are still some problems. The yellow parts, and I think these yellow parts is what we saw in the beginning, the black squares. So what happens if we subdivide this one time, our low poly version? Let's see if we then have the problem. So again, select the high polygon, then shift select the low polygon, bake it again with that subdivision on, and then it looks better. It looks like it should have been. So I don't know if this is a problem in Blender, but we'll continue for this tutorial. If we look in texture mode, it still looks blue, which somehow it puts our normal in our diffuse color. That's we didn't ask for that, but that can be Blender. So let's try to fix that. Here we can see it's in our diffuse. Look, yeah, there it's blue. But let's first save our normal that we just baked. Let's overwrite that to the normal map. Okay. Let's refresh the diffuse, so that's again fixed. And now you can see the difference between the normal map enabled and disabled. Let's just change that color a bit of the plane, that it's not so distracting. Okay, so now let's see how this looks in our rendering mode. The first thing I notice is that there's no bump on the paper material where the tobacco is, so it's pretty blurry. So I guess the problem is that not your low poly model should have also a bump map, but it should be your high poly. And then when you bake it will also add the bump map to your normal map. So we'll have to redo that part. So always put the bump map on your high poly model and not on your low poly. So this is the high poly, the diffuse and the bump are enabled. And what we can do now is rebake and see what happens. And yes, this is what we wanted. So first of all, we have the normals of the shape, the differences in shape of the high and the low, plus we have the bump map of the high poly model added into one normal. You cannot combine bump maps and normals afterwards or in a game or visual online. It's always one normal map. So that is fixed. And now we have our high and low poly version. You see, when I enable or disable bump, it doesn't add or change anything. So it just deals with the normal map. Let's just save this out, and that's that for this tutorial. Thank you for watching.